Good morning. Thank you, Carol and Thomas Bernard, for the invitation. I'm going to be continuing with this discussion of a shift from the subjective survey to the objective inventory. Thank you. So, inventories take stock of a situation. Studies seek to make connections, uncover deeper meanings. Surveys attempt to derive qualitative meaning from broad analysis. But the inventory simply collects, creating an index of the current state of affairs. The inventory presents parts and pieces, leaving the determination of the whole yet to be defined. The inventory offers no solution and is inherently critical. It takes stock of the situation so that we can decide what to do next. Towards a generic public, the critical inventory presented in the exhibition is a survey of privately owned public space, which is an increasingly common typology in New York City, where I come from, as well as major cities across the world, and is representative of this broader shift or tendency of the built environment in which public and private are increasingly blurred. The notion of public is an elusive condition of the urban realm. Is it a discrete place, an urban void, an action, or a behavior? A simple Google image search returns countless images of green grass, benches, people sitting in groups of 2 or 3 or 4, evenly distributed across the lawn. Only after scrolling through dozens of images is there a picture of a crowd. According to this visual survey, public space can be averaged together as a half-empty green space contained within hardscaped pathways, in which passive behaviors and limited social interaction are the norm. You've seen one urban public plaza, you've seen them all. Since 1961, the distinction between public and private in the urban space of New York City has been blurred by a distribution or a distributed network of public spaces that are owned and operated by private entities. These are privately owned public spaces, or POPs, that are created from a development incentive, which offers additional building height, an FAR, to new buildings in exchange for providing an open and publicly accessible plaza on the property. These public spaces are controlled, maintained, and operated by the private property owner, and while regulated by municipal zoning laws, are subjected to the material provisions and behavioral guidelines of that private entity. Far from the liberated spaces of the public right-of-way, or the freedom of expression associated with iconic public squares, POPs restrict public behavior on their grounds quite literally to a list of do's and don'ts. So according to the New York City Planning Department, POPs are spaces dedicated to public use and enjoyment. They provide a myriad of opportunities to sit, relax, people watch, eat, meet others, in other words, to partake and enjoy in urban life. They come in many shapes and sizes with a variety of amenities and are aimed at ensuring that the densest areas of our city offer a measure of open public space and greenery. On the New York City Capital Planning website, they have published extensive data about these privately owned public spaces, including an interactive map which you can see the locations and information about all of these individual spaces. And you can see the distribution reflects the real estate and development booms of the past half century, including development in Lower Manhattan and in Midtown. POPs are primarily located in Manhattan, following obviously development trends of the past 60 years, but are slowly creeping out into the other boroughs. So these are quantified. There are about 550 distinct spaces on about 350 properties. and they can be distinguished across all of these various typologies, which are also slowly converging as zoning regulations change. So the survey presented today is rather a figural representation of all POPs in isolation, without a narrative description, a categorization, or a qualification. The total size of POPs is approximately 3.5 million square feet, which is about 9 Bryant Parks, 24 Union Squares, or 10% of Central Park. And this comparison to iconic parks is significant not only based on size and area, but also because of the intended association with parks. You'll see that the logo for POPs includes a tree, which is intended to associate public plazas with the spaces of exception like Central Park in New York City, which are intended to be a kind of natural escape from the concrete jungle. However, the origin of POPs comes from something quite different. It's based on Mies van der Rohe's Seagram building from 1917, which is an original model for POPs as it set the building back from the property line and created an open, publicly accessible void in front of the building. So this introduced a strategy to preserve open space within the density of the city, and is a clear example of what Boris Groys calls the modernist production of public space, in which it functions as a reduction of design, in which the goal is to create a blank void space at the center of the designed world. And this idea of public as void is inherent in sort of urban discourse for centuries. We already saw Noli this morning, but the iconic map of Rome presents the city as a public-private binary in which public is the void space, the ubiquitous kind of territory that is pre-existent. And going back even further, the public void has always been kind of considered a compositional element within the city. So that idea that the public space equals void is articulated in the language from the 1961 zoning, which introduced the idea of POPs, or the floor area bonus for a plaza, which describes a plaza as an open area accessible to the public at all times. So this zoning resolution, with very little kind of requirements for these spaces, was actually the guidelines for more than half of POPs that exist today. In subsequent years, which I'll talk a little bit about, key zoning resolutions have increased the amount of regulation and restrictions and requirements for POPs. But as a public space does not really need to be updated to the current regulations unless it is sort of renovated, there exists this kind of static public space, which is kind of born of an earlier generation of public and not quite representative of neither the public realm as it is today nor the restrictions and requirements under current zoning. So the first 15 years of POPs produced a series of residual open spaces adjacent to buildings, which offered very little in terms of public benefit, produced a series of bland, cold spaces with little identity and certainly little publicness. And in some cases, like along 6th Avenue near Rockefeller Center, a succession of Seagram building typologies produced an obliteration of the street wall. So the exception becomes the rule, and therefore the urban space is dramatically affected. So in response to these conditions, the city increased the complexity of regulations in the subsequent zoning amendment in 1975 and 1977, increasing the specificity of the types of POPs and the requirements associated with them, including amenities, and also allowed for what was called visual residual spaces, which allowed up to 30% of the area to be uninhabitable, just planting or kind of visually open space. So that series of regulations produced a series of public spaces that were actually more scenic, again, reminiscent of the idea of the park, but more, in some ways, more an image of that kind of green space than an experiential one. About 20 years ago, there was a significant comprehensive survey of POPs conducted by Harvard professor of urban design Gerald Caden in association with the city planning department, which categorized the existing plazas into qualitative groups: destination, neighborhood, circulation, hiatus, and marginal. So they gathered extensive empirical data and defined the success of the POPs on a plaza-by-plaza basis, highlighting their shortcomings and offering recommendations for the future of this typology. But the largest group was the marginal spaces, which lack satisfactory levels of design, amenities, or aesthetic appeal, and thus deter public use for any purpose. They were described to be barren, inhospitable, having no functional amenities, poorly maintained. And this subjective survey was very influential in the most recent zoning amendments, which in some ways reduced complexity but increased specificity and descriptiveness in the requirements for these spaces. So now there includes language of not only type and configuration and amenities, but very detailed requirements for seating, specific seating types relative to the size of the plaza, specific requirements for planting, even aesthetic requirements such as material uniformity or kind of continuity with the space around it. And while these requirements are intended to produce a kind of better kind of public, they, rather than offering dynamic public spaces that augment the publicness of the urban environment, the majority of POPs plazas contribute to a surplus of banal spaces in the city. Their physical conditions blend together as a variation on the same conventional themes: hard surfaces, fixed seating, little to no adaptability. In this way, the public imagination is further constrained within an atmosphere of bland urban sameness. Without distinct identity, these plazas assimilate as a distributed series of non-places, a concept developed by French anthropologist Marc Auger that describes spaces of transience and anonymity, lacking the identity and associative meaning of anthropological places. So a space which cannot be defined as relational, historical, or concerned with identity will be a non-place. And this image shows one POPs very recently constructed adjacent to the super tall building at 432 Park by Raphael Vignoli, and a kind of strange situation for a public plaza adjacent to one of the most expensive luxury towers in the city, and not surprisingly, mostly empty and quite austere. So POPs have become somewhat ubiquitous and almost invisible in their anonymity. They are barely occupied and unremarkable, and their individual identities are increasingly blurred together. Those that are distinctive are kind of holdovers from past, and Consequently, the system of public spaces POPs could have created has no spatial coherence, no visual hierarchy, and no experiential logic at all. So this drawing of an average POPs presents a public plaza derived from purely the current zoning and design standards for POPs that is essentially interchangeable with the existing POPs. It is both real and not real at the same time. And these spaces are the British landscape architect speaking about this practice in London calls these spaces beige holes. Beige because they reflect the non-tastes of the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, and beige because they place the power of the transaction over local distinctiveness. So a series of maps presented in the other room presents some other possible narratives, shortcomings, and tendencies within the collection of POPs. They visualize these facts as simple and straightforward graphic answers to the following questions. When was the POPs built relative to key zoning amendments and changes in the requirements? Is it open 24/7 or has it been allowed nighttime closure? Has it been altered since its original construction? Was the designer of the public space the same as that of the building? And would the plaza comply with the present design standards? If not, why? A model shows or visualizes how much the building gained in exchange for the public plaza. These questions and their respective maps reveal another strange paradox of POPs. As standards and requirements become more narrow and prescriptive, older POPs that no longer comply but can remain unchanged as isolated remnants of a past version of public. So these are, for instance, the too small POPs, which is less than 2,000 square feet, which is the current minimum, or the too minor, too irregularly shaped, as now they are intended to be mostly rectangular, with the majority of their space 40 feet deep. The too high, which is more than 2 feet above street level, or the too low, which is the inverse. The too austere, which is amenity-less but used for functional activities such as loading. The too obscure, which is does not have enough visibility from the street. Or the too opaque, which is the surplus of blank walls, which is also against the rules. The too anti-street, the continuous setback. Or finally, the too unruly, as in the case of Zuccotti Park, which became the site of Occupy Wall Street in 2011, in which the protesters were actually acting within the rules of the POPs, which at the time was open 24/7. And then upon their eviction, the rules were changed to very specifically restrict that kind of behavior. So a collection of odd POPs, they neither fit in nor stand out. The unique characteristics of each space, too awkward, too big, too small, too hidden, too austere, would likely not meet today's POPs design standards. Which is more public, the idealized average or the unique instance? While these regulations have evolved to facilitate better public spaces, the increased prescriptiveness of such rules reduces the possibility of new oddities and strangeness in the public realm. So to conclude, public space is a shared resource that offers possibility and dynamism to the city. It facilitates chance encounters, collective experience, and social and civic expression. But as public space moves toward a prescriptive and passive use over the active, the beige rather than the distinctive, these essential qualities of the public realm recede. As a means of creating new instances of public space in city today, privately owned public spaces could function as activators of the urban realm. At present, however, they appear to be doing the opposite as a distributed network of an increasingly generic public.
Thank you, Lindsay. We already have a question. 2 questions already.
Hi, thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. I have a very simple question that might be difficult to answer. Do you find that there is a relationship between typology of those pops with the type of use and vibrancy they have, and how does it manifest?
Well, typology is also something that is sort of being stripped away as pops become, more restricted to this very average condition. So originally I was very interested in the distinct typologies, especially, for example, the expanded sidewalk, which is the kind of most invisible, and arguably, there is very little awareness of this as a public space. But in my mind, there's a lot of opportunity in these sort of micro typologies of publicness. I'm very interested in speculating about how they might become more visually expressed or more experientially distinct. But today, I think the tendency is, like I said, to kind of erase typology. And in that way, I think that is actually what is producing more and more assimilation across all these public plazas. The idea that a public space has a minimum and maximum size, that it has an ideal configuration, that it can be, reduced down to a series of requirements and essential components, to me sounds kind of reminiscent of the new urbanist strategy, a kind of paint by number public, right, which is the anti-typology. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I think this is great work. My question is about the surveying, actually. I believe that some of the information that you collected were available through building records, but I also assume that there was probably some kind of site visitations and sort of empirical documentation on the street. So can you take us through this process briefly, please?
Sure. Because I intended to position this as not necessarily a response, but to distinguish this inventory from the 2000 study, which was very much based on in-person observation and sort of empirical data. I attempted to base most of the inventory on publicly accessible data that the city publishes, Google image visits, and of course the kind of research about the zoning requirements and design standards in place. Of course, I live in New York City. I also teach courses related to the subject matter. I take students to these spaces. I particularly enjoy the fact that you can sort of wander through the city, and once you become aware of pops, kind of find them in all of these strange places. The kind of open arcade beneath a unremarkable residential building in Midtown is actually a public space. So in some ways, of course, my subjective experience and my observation from in-person visits is informing this. The intention was to use the data and more objective forms of documentation and research to inform the inventory and produce to reduce the kind of, my personal bias, although of course there's also bias in those forms of information as well. But, yeah.
Thank you. That was really terrific work. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if, in your experience, if these places are credited back to firms. It strikes me that there's a kind of effort to make really anonymous the way in which you draw them and the way in which you often include the address, but not the firm. I'm sure some would be hard to find, but then I also think some of them are probably fairly well known, or there are firms whose reputation was developed in the 70s and the 80s on these kinds of like opportunities, right, for design at a really, really small scale?
Especially the most recent POPs. So this map, it's a little bit different, difficult to see, but it's actually a map which just distinguishes the plazas that were sort of designed by the same architect or developer as the building, and those which were a distinct architect. The more recent plazas have been, or are more typically a unique author. There is a relatively recent POPs, which I didn't show, that was designed by the landscape architect Scape, which is a practice that focuses on much larger spaces of urbanism, and so it's interesting that they took on a kind of small typology. Personally, I think, so my intention was not to offer any solutions, but personally I think one way to start to push back against these trends would be to actually require a different author of the POPs than the building itself. The intention of a lot of the requirements and zoning restrictions is to sort of blend them in with public space or blend them in with the adjacent surroundings. But of course, I think it would be interesting to think of these spaces more as objects in and of themselves rather than voids. So the intention of this model is to sort of show this kind of volumetric exchange between building that was gained from the provision of a public plaza and the plaza itself, and thinking about those more as equal objects rather than a kind of solid void relationship.
Let's have one question. You can keep one for the break.
Just a very short one. Thank you. I think highly relevant, amazing research. Is there a reason why you exclude interiors? Like New York is famous for this kind of private-owned lobbies, or Lincoln Center, or whatever, Ford Foundation, and.
I think I have one photo. This one, which is a space that was designed by the late Kevin Roche in the 80s. The interior ones, I think, tend to have more of a specific identity. This one is one of my favorites. They are also, at least the ones that are being built now, are less commonly interior. I think there's a huge opportunity with interior public spaces, as they offer obviously different source of public resources like conditioned space. But for the purpose of this survey, the interiors are sort of being averaged out in some ways, because the tendency is to provide this outdoor space. So they are kind of minimized in this presentation, but certainly still part of my survey.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.